HaKadosh Baruch Hu Sheker Achein Behevel Hayofi Isha Yiras Hashem Ki Tisala Tivanu Bacharta Sanu Kidashta Mikol Hamim
Kol Mikadesh
The Y Studs doing the evolution of Shabbos music. Guys, you're killing me. I mean, it's like every one of those songs is such a great song, but they're doing all the Shabbos music in one video. It's a lot of fun. We're actually sharing it on the Accidental Talmudist Facebook page. I think right now Nina already shared it. But that's their new video, The Evolution of Shabbos. What I'd really like to do is spend Shabbos with the Y Studs, a Kabbalah Shabbos, so they could do all those songs in their entirety. They're great. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. All right. Moving forward in Tractate Yevamos. It's always exciting. Who's with us on a Thursday night? Renee in Indiana, Stephen in New Hampshire, Yehuda in South Carolina, Bill in mid-Missouri, Melissa in Great Neck, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, Karen in Northern California, Bella in Florida, Paul in the Great Northwest, Lucy in Minnesota, Elvis in New York, Stephen in Oklahoma, Guy in Ohio, Michael in New Jersey, Nancy in North Carolina, PK in Colorado, Debbie in New Jersey, Pauline in Arkansas, Patrice in Utah. Over there on the YouTube side, Samantha in Tacoma, Lynn in North Texas, Aoife in Florida, and Faith in Grants Pass, Oregon. Welcome, everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily, sponsored by our good friend Shimon Lenz, in memory of his father, I believe, Yaakov Ben Beryl. May the neshama have a great aliyah. May the merit of our learning today accrue to your father's memory and to his soul. Lift him even just a little bit higher in the world of souls. And Shimon, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. We say amen. And thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. We continue our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 1 of Tractate Yevamos. This is also the beginning of Seder Nashim, the third Seder, the third of 6 sections of the Talmud. We're going to have a bunch of tractates in this section exploring the laws and relationships between men and women. So as we discussed yesterday, what we're really examining in this tractate, Yevamos, which is the plural of Yevama, right? And the Yevama is the widow of a man who died before he had any children, and he has a brother who is the Yavam, right? And so the Torah says that if a man in Israel dies before he has children, and he has a brother, that brother should marry the widow. And then the first child of that union is considered the heir of the brother who passed away before having children. But it's an interesting mitzvah in the Torah because the two of them have a choice. They don't have to do this marriage. They're qualified in that situation, but they can choose to do the ceremony of chalitzah instead. But they must do one or the other. So if there is a man who dies childless and he has a brother, and that wife, this is what we were talking about yesterday, is otherwise permitted to the surviving brother. There's no other prohibited relationship, right? Since in old times you could actually marry your niece. So then, if the brother dies, whose wife she is, then, who is his brother? Well, her father. Obviously, a father can't marry his daughter, and there's a bunch of other prohibited relationships like that. So if one of those relationships exist between the surviving brother and the widow, then there is no yibum, or levirate marriage, and chalitzah is not necessary. None of this applies. And if the one who died had more than one wife, and he didn't have children by any of them, right? So then the surviving brother has to either marry both of those wives or perform chalitzah with them. But if even one of those wives is disqualified because there's a prohibited relationship between her and the surviving brother, I mean, like some kind of the daughter or the daughter's daughter or the maternal sisters, any kind of prohibited relationships in the Torah between the surviving brother and these wives, then any one of the wives, then all of the wives are exempt from yibum, levirate marriage. And if they're exempt from yibum, they're also exempt from chalitzah, the alternative ceremony. All right, that's the Mishnah that we read yesterday. And today we begin the Gemara, the discussion of that Mishnah. So we pick it up at the bottom of page 2b. Today's page is Gimel, page 3. The Gemara asks a question with regard to the order of the Mishnah's list. In our Mishnah, there were 15 women who have some kind of familial relationship with the surviving brother, which disqualifies them from having yibum or chalitzah. And if there are multiple wives of the brother who died, so even though only one of the wives has this prohibited familial relationship, all of them become exempt from both yibum and chalitzah. But there was 15 of these women, 15 people with these familial relationships mentioned. And now the Gemara is going to start examining, well, these 15 women who were mentioned, who have some kind of familial relationship with the surviving brother, why were they mentioned in the particular order in which they were mentioned? So the Gemara asks a question with regard to the law. Let me just change something here. Asks a question with regard to the order of the Mishnah's list. Now, since the law that all these women with whom relations are forbidden are exempt from yibum, right? I'm just going to be saying yibum because these words come up so often. I'm not going to keep translating. Levirate marriage, right? This marriage of the surviving brother and the widow, that's called yibum. That's why she's the Yevama and the surviving brother is the Yavam. And the ceremony, which is the alternative ceremony, is called chalitzah. All right? I'm not going to keep translating those particular terms. Now, since the law that all these women with whom relations are forbidden are exempt from yibum and exempt their co-wives, and that this is derived from the particular case of a wife's sister, that a man cannot marry two sisters, as demonstrated later. And from that, we learn out that the co-wives are exempted from the teaching about you can't marry two sisters, that in fact the co-wives are exempted. If one of the wives can't marry the Yavam, none of the wives can marry the Yavam. So we learn that out from the law of you can't marry a wife and her sister. You can't marry a woman and her sister, as we'll demonstrate later. So in that case, since we derive all these exemptions from that particular case, so why doesn't the Mishnah teach the case of the wife's sister first, right? That the wife's sister exempts these other relationships. Why isn't that taught first, since we learn many laws from it? Let the Mishnah teach the case of a wife's sister first, and only afterward mention the other instances which are derived from that law. Says Rav Steinsaltz, although the Gemara elsewhere in Sanhedrin 49b states that the Mishnah does not typically arrange its subjects in logical order, right? It's not that there needs to be a logic that, okay, because this particular relationship, we learn out a law about it that applies to all the other cases, so we should state that case first. Makes sense, but the Mishnah isn't usually arranged that way. It is nevertheless proper to seek a rationale for its order, even if it has no halakhic implications, right? So this is what the Gemara is asking. You might say, well, what difference does it make? The list is the list, but we're going to ask some questions about the order of the items on the list. And if you would say that the Tana, the rabbi of our Mishnah, cited the cases in order of severity, Well, then you must say that it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, who says that execution by burning is more severe than by stoning, right? So there's 4 types of death penalty in the Torah. There's burning, stoning, decapitation, and strangulation, right? So if you commit a death penalty offense, those are the 4 kinds of death penalties. And you might think, well, what difference does it make to the defendant who is, sentenced to death, what kind of death penalty he gets? But, elsewhere in the Talmud, they rank the severity of the transgressions that lead to the death penalty. And it's just worth mentioning here, now when we're talking about Torah offenses that lead to a death penalty, they were hardly ever imposed by a rabbinic court in Jewish history. Why? Because the death penalty only applies if a person was warned with witnesses watching that if you do such and such, you will be subject to the death penalty. They said that to the person right before he did it, and with witnesses watching, he did it anyway. That's the only time that you're subject to the death penalty. So that hardly ever happened. But okay. So for this reason, the Tana began with the cases of one's daughter and his daughter's daughter. Right? This is the case, like we talked yesterday, that if if a woman married her uncle, right, and then the husband died, so then, the surviving brother is her father. You can't marry your daughter. That's a death penalty offense. Nor can you marry your daughter's daughter, right? That's also prohibited. Because those relationships are prohibited, so then yibum and chalitzah just don't even apply. And that was the cases we're talking about. But in what order were these cases given? Right, so the rabbi, the Mishna began with the cases of one's daughter and his daughter's daughter, right, his daughter and his granddaughter, and his son's daughter, which is also his granddaughter, and so forth. Since one who has relations with these women is punished by burning, after which the Tana listed those cases that entail a lesser penalty. So maybe that's how the order was determined of which cases were given. However, the Gemara argues that even so, the order of the cases listed in the Mishnah remains problematic. If so, let him teach the case of one's mother-in-law first. You cannot, marry or have relations with your mother-in-law. That's a death penalty offense. As the main transgression that entails burning is written with regard to his mother-in-law, as it is stated in the Torah, Leviticus 20:14, and if a man take with his wife also her mother, it is wickedness. They shall be burnt with fire, both he and they. Here it's translated as it is wickedness. I've seen other translation, it is a depraved plot, right, to sleep with a woman and her mother. And so then all of them, the man and the woman and her mother that participated in such a transgression are subject to the death penalty by burning. And furthermore, after his mother-in-law, let the rabbi of the Mishnah teach his daughter-in-law, as after execution by burning, stoning is the most severe of the other capital punishments imposed by the rabbinic court. Rather, the Gemara retracts the previous explanation that we're ranking them in terms of severity, because that doesn't hold up when we look at the list. So the Gemara retracts the previous explanation in favor of the following. Well, with regard to his daughter, since the prohibition is actually derived from a homiletical interpretation and is not explicitly stated in the Torah, it is therefore dear to the Tana, to the rabbi. Consequently, he listed this novel case of a daughter first. The Torah doesn't actually say you can't have sex with your daughter. That's actually derived from a similar law, but it's not explicitly stated. And so here the idea is that rabbis who derived important laws, but that weren't stated explicitly in the Torah from similar laws, then that derivation would be dear to the rabbi who derived it, and that's why he listed that case ahead of the other cases. Now we're at the top of 3a, and the Gemara challenges this conclusion. All of the exemptions from levirate marriage for forbidden relatives listed in the Mishnah are also derived from a homiletical interpretation. The Gemara responds, well, although the matter of yibum is derived from a homiletical interpretation, not explicitly stated but derived, the main aspect of their prohibition is explicitly written. By contrast, with regard to his daughter from a woman that he raped but did not marry, the main aspect of this prohibition is derived by homiletical interpretation, as the prohibition itself is not written explicitly in the Torah, right? It's written in the Torah that you can't have sex with a woman who is the daughter of a woman you raped. Really, they're talking about the case of soldiers who, commit rape in a war. But at any rate, the offspring of that illegitimate union is not permitted to you. It's absolutely prohibited. It never mentions that you can't have, you can't marry your daughter from your wife who's illegitimate. You marry legitimately, but it's derived from this other case. So as Rava said, Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi said to me, this prohibition is derived by means of a verbal analogy, linking two words in the Torah that are the same word and used in two different laws, and so there's a link between those laws. So we look at the word henna in the verse. The nakedness of your son's daughter or of your daughter's daughter, even their nakedness you shall not uncover, for theirs, henna, is your own nakedness. You can't do that because it's your family. Leviticus 18:10, and the word henna, theirs, is used in a different verse. In Leviticus 18:17, you shall not uncover the nakedness of a woman and her daughter. You shall not take her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter to uncover her nakedness. They, henna, are near kinswomen. It is wickedness, indicating that every daughter is prohibited, even one from rape, just like one's daughter through his wife. Furthermore, it is derived from a verbal analogy between the word wickedness in Leviticus 18:17 and the word wickedness in Leviticus 20:14. And if a man take with his wife also her mother, it is wickedness. They shall be burnt with fire, both he and they, that there be no wickedness among you, right? Among the children of Israel. That one who has sexual intercourse with a daughter from a rape is liable to burning. Now the Gemara asks, okay, so now that you said that all matters that are derived from a homiletical interpretation are dear to the rabbi who composed this Mishnah, and he therefore gives them precedence, so let him teach the case of a wife's sister last, as this is the source of the law and is therefore the most straightforward case. We're going to make homiletical derivations from that law, so that should be the last one, since that's the most straightforward. If he likes to list things that are derived because it's more dear to him than that which is explicitly stated, then that which is explicitly stated should come last. But it didn't come last in the list of prohibited relations that exempt one from yibum and chalitzah. And the Gemara responds, well, since the Tana was dealing with the prohibition with regard to different types of sisters, he also taught together with them the prohibition with regard to his wife's sister. And the Gemara asks, but if so, let him teach this entire section involving sisters at the end when he mentions a wife's sister. Rather, the Gemara rejects the above answer in favor of an alternative explanation. The Tana cited the cases in order of closeness, i.e., the Mishnah is ordered in accordance with the relative closeness of the various incestuous and prohibited relations. How so? The Tana taught the cases of one's daughter, and the daughter of his daughter, and the daughter of his son, who are his own blood relatives. And since he taught 3 generations of one's own offspring below, i.e. his daughter's daughter, and his son's daughter, so he also taught 3 generations of his wife's offspring below, i.e. his wife herself, her daughter, and her daughter's daughter. And since he taught 3 generations of his wife's offspring below, he also taught 3 generations of her family above, i.e. from previous generations, namely herself, her mother, his mother-in-law, and his mother-in-law's mother, that you should not marry your wife's grandmother, right? And afterward, he taught the case of his sister and his mother's sister, who are his own blood relatives, but less closely related to him than his daughter. And since he was dealing with the prohibition with regard to sisters, he also taught the case of his wife's sister. And by right, the Tana of the Mishnah should have preceded the case of his daughter-in-law before that of a wife of a brother with whom he did not coexist, as it is not due to their relationship that she is prohibited, but rather because she is excluded from the mitzvah of yibum, since the 2 brothers were never alive at the same time. The brother who died died before his brother was born, right? It's still his brother. They're from the same parents, but since that brother was born after the childless brother died, there is no yibum or chalitzah that attaches to this new brother because he wasn't alive when his older brother was alive. However, since he was dealing with the prohibition with regard to siblings, the Tana of the Mishnah taught the case of a wife of a brother with whom he did not coexist, as this also involves a sibling. And then the Tana of the Mishnah taught the case of his daughter-in-law. So it's like coming up with a rationale for the particular order of all these prohibited relationships listed in our Mishnah. Now the Gemara goes on to something a little new. The Gemara continues to analyze the language of the Mishnah, not the order of the cases, but why does the Tana specifically teach that these women, because of their prohibited relationships with the Yavam, right, the surviving brother, that they exempt their co-wives? Let him rather say they prohibit, right? So this woman who is, because the way that the cases were stated, right in our opening Mishnah, is that these women are prohibited from marrying the surviving brother because they have a familial relationship with him, and it would be incestuous. And they exempt their co-wives, right? The one who died without children had more than one wife. He had two wives at the same time. So one of those wives has a familial relationship with the surviving brother. The other wife doesn't. But because one of the wives has such a relationship, the co-wife is also exempt. Now, the Gemara is asking, well, since this wife who is prohibited to the surviving brother, and that's why yibum and chalitzah don't apply, why isn't the wording of the Mishnah that these women are prohibited to marry the Yavam, and therefore their co-wives are also prohibited because they are co-wives? Why does it instead use the term exempt, right? That yibum and chalitzah do not apply. Why doesn't it say these women are prohibited? Let the Tana say they prohibit the co-wives, as ultimately the co-wives are not only exempt from yibum, but each is actually forbidden to her Yavam. They are prohibited to marry the Yavam, even though they don't have a familial relationship with him, because their co-wife is prohibited to the Yavam. And the Gemara explains that if he had taught they prohibit them, using this term prohibit, I would say that this means it is prohibited to enter into yibum, this levirate marriage, but that she must perform chalitzah, the ceremony that exempts one from yibum, that the alternative mitzvah. Therefore, it teaches us using the language of exemption rather than prohibition to indicate that she and her co-wife both are entirely exempt and there's neither yibum nor chalitzah. But the Gemara raises a difficulty with this. If so, let the rabbi of the Mishnah teach she is prohibited from performing chalitzah. But the Gemara rejects this suggestion. It is impossible to formulate the law in this manner, as even if they perform chalitzah, what has he really done? What is wrong with a man allowing a woman to take off his shoe, which is the act of chalitzah, right? When you do chalitzah, instead of yibum, what happens? You gather in front of a beis din, in front of a court of three rabbis, and you have this ceremony which involves the Yevama taking off the shoe of the Yavam, literally taking off his shoe. That's what the Torah says. She shall remove his sandal. And then they each have to recite, ritual words, right? That this man does not, he says, I will not take her as my wife. This man will not, extend the line of his brother who died before having children. And the words are somewhat humiliating to the man, that rather than marry this woman, he declines, but because of that, his brother who died, his line ends, right? Because the first child of the yibum would be considered the heir of the brother who died, it's like he didn't really die in the sense that his line did not die, right? He had, in a sense, he has children through his own brother and the widow. And if they decline to do that, right, then that's bad. It's bad, right? It's bad for the brother who died. However, because yibum has all kinds of problems associated with, as we'll discuss soon, in some cases, chalitzah is absolutely preferred, and the rabbis encourage the people to do chalitzah and not yibum. At any rate, So what they're saying here, now they're just saying, well, so what's the big deal about performing chalitzah? If they're not going to be in yibum, even though they're exempt from yibum, why not just let them perform chalitzah since they're not going to get married anyway? Why say they're exempt from both yibum and chalitzah? So if they perform chalitzah, what has he really done? What is wrong with a man allowing a woman to take off his shoe, which is the act of chalitzah? Consequently, it is not possible to state prohibited from performing chalitzah. They're not prohibited, they're exempt from it. And the Gemara asks, why not? There is in fact a prohibited element here. If you say she performs chalitzah, it might be said that she may also enter into yibum. If chalitzah is the alternative to yibum and you allow them to perform chalitzah, other people might think, well, if they can perform chalitzah, then obviously they could also perform yibum. And so even though it's prohibited, they might go ahead and do that. And that's why we use this language of exempt, but maybe you should have said prohibited. If you say she performs chalitzah, it might be said she may also perform yibum, and that in this specific instance he performed chalitzah merely because he did not wish to marry her. In that case, it might be erroneously claimed that if another person wished to marry the co-wife of his Yevama, he is permitted to enter into yibum with her, and it's not. If one of the wives is prohibited to the Yavam, all of the co-wives are. So in light of the previous argument, the Gemara suggests another reason that the Mishnah does not use the expression prohibited, but rather uses the expression exempt. Since it is only in cases where the mitzvah of yibum applies that the co-wife is forbidden to him, and where no mitzvah applies, she is permitted, as it is permitted for the man to marry the widowed co-wife of a non-relative. Due to that reason, he taught they exempt the co-wives and not they prohibit them. In other words, the rabbi is teaching that they are not prohibited to him in their own right. Right? One of the wives is prohibited to the Yavam because she has a familiar relationship with him. The other co-wife doesn't. So she's not really prohibited. She's exempt because her co-wife is prohibited. Now the Gemara continues analyzing the wording. And why does the rabbi of the Mishnah specifically teach exempt from chalitzah and from yibum? Let the rabbi say instead, exempt from yibum. That would be enough. And the Gemara answers, if he were to teach exempt from yibum, I would say that she must perform chalitzah and she must not enter into yibum. The rabbi therefore teaches us that every woman who is eligible for yibum is also eligible for chalitzah, and anyone who is ineligible for yibum is likewise ineligible for chalitzah, as no obligation of the chalitzah ceremony applies unless there is an obligation for yibum. And the Gemara further inquires, okay, so let the rabbi teach exempt from yibum and from chalitzah. The Torah states the option of yibum first. So why does it say exempt from chalitzah and yibum? Alternatively, let him teach from chalitzah alone, as this would indicate that she may not enter into yibum either. And the Gemara answers, the Mishnah is worded this way in accordance with the opinion of Abba Shaul, who said the mitzvah of chalitzah takes precedence over the mitzvah of yibum. We list chalitzah first because we prefer that the brother not marry his dead brother's widow. Even though the Torah says he should, the Torah also provides the alternative mitzvah of chalitzah, and we, the sages, at least the ones who agree with Abba Shaul, say no, we would rather he perform chalitzah and not marry her. Right? Even though this means that the brother who died childless will not have heirs and like his line will end, in that sense, it is better that happen than that his brother marry his widow. Why? Why would Abba Shaul say that? It seems like this is, the Torah, like God went out of his way to say, this is what you should do. Why are the sages now saying, well, God also gave the alternative, the chalitzah ceremony, and we prefer the alternative. We think you should do that. Why? Abba Shaul maintains that one who does not enter into yibum for the sake of heaven transgresses the prohibition against marrying his brother's wife. and therefore it would be better in every case to perform chalitzah. Consequently, the rabbi of the Mishnah mentions chalitzah before yibum. Now, we're going to come to this discussion later on page 39 of our tractate. But basically, what Abba Shaul is saying there is there's a concern that the reason that the surviving brother is marrying this widow is not because, the good nature of his heart and he wants to do this mitzvah for the sake of his poor dead brother so that, he should be remembered and have a child in this world. But rather, it might be that the reason that this surviving brother is doing it is because he thinks that the widow's really good looking and he's kind of into her, right? Which is sort of like the reason you would think he would choose to do that instead of chalitzah, because he's into her. But if he's into her, then he's not really doing that mitzvah for the sake of heaven. He's doing it so that he can be with that woman. And that's problematic because even though the Torah arranges that in these circumstances the man died childless and his surviving brother should marry the widow, right, to do the mitzvah, but if really his inner motive is more like he just wants to be with that woman, so now we bring the prohibition into play that you cannot marry your brother's sister, right? Families spend a lot of time together, and we don't want any inkling of this idea that a man might be into his sister-in-law, and that, now that his brother's dead, this is his opportunity to really be with her. Especially since he can have multiple wives, he could have, his own wife and now that sister-in-law that he's been eyeing from a distance. And it becomes, wicked. And Abba Shaul says, lest we even take a risk that might be the situation, much better people should perform chalitzah. Now, yesterday, when we started this subject, I mentioned that, this really doesn't happen in modern times, right? Neither yibum nor chalitzah. And I said, and I believe it's probably because, we don't have multiple wives either. So this whole situation really just doesn't work very well. Now, I misspoke. I did a little research last night. And what's interesting is the mitzvah does apply, right? Now, we don't take second wives. I mean, like simultaneous wives, co-wives. We're not, that law changed. And you can't have multiple wives. So yibum is not really on the table. But if you don't have a wife, right, the surviving brother is single, so yibum could happen, technically. But because, of this teaching of Abba Shaul, and that basically is the law, that's definitely the way that any based in is going to lean and say, don't marry her. It's inappropriate. But you do have to do chalitzah. Still unusual, right, that a man dies so young before he had children and there is a surviving brother there. But in that situation, they might have to perform chalitzah. Now, sometimes what they will do is sort of go out of their way to make the original marriage like there was something wrong with it. There was some detail that wasn't done in the original marriage, so it's considered annulled. Like there never really was a marriage. There wasn't children anyway. And so they don't have to perform chalitzah. But if they don't find that escape clause, as it were, then it does happen from time to time that in that situation, the surviving brother and the widow will appear before a beis din, and they'll just go through this ritual ceremony. It doesn't take a lot of time. They understand everybody's doing it for the sake of this mitzvah. And then they perform chalitzah. And then that's important because then they're fully released from each other. Now there is no bond between them. But if they don't perform chalitzah and the woman goes off and marries someone else before performing chalitzah, then there's a concern that the children of that marriage, which she's perfectly entitled to do, her husband died, she can marry again. But if she didn't perform chalitzah with the man's brother, then there could be issues halachically with her second marriage to, some other party. So, God forbid you're ever in this very tragic situation that a man dies without having children. There's a widow, he has a surviving brother, the man is single, or even if he's not single, they're going to have to perform this chalitzah ceremony. So, get rabbinic counsel in that situation. Now, the Gemara asks another question with regard to the language of the Mishnah. The enumeration of the first clause of our Mishnah, 15 women, which indicates that those women alone are included in this list, serves to exclude what? Why does it say 15 women? Does it mean that there's another case that might have been the 16th case, but we dismiss it and it's excluded? Is that why 15 is particularly mentioned in our Mishnah? It could have just said these women, but it says 15 women. Why? So is it mentioned to exclude something? Which other cases might have been included? And the enumeration of the latter clause, which states these exempt their co-wives, again meaning these and no others, again serves to exclude what? What might have been on the list that didn't make the list? Since the Mishnah specifies only these women and no others, the Gemara asks which other women might have been included in these lists. We're on the B side of page 3 now. And the Gemara answers that these enumerations come to exclude those additions of Rav and Rav Asi. Rav added the co-wife of a woman suspected by her husband of adultery, the sota. That's another whole area, and we have a whole tractate in the Talmud about it. But a woman who is suspected of committing adultery because she secluded herself with a man who's not her husband, and now her husband is jealous and suspicious, and they would go to Jerusalem when the temple was standing, and they would perform this ceremony in the temple where she would drink this water mixed with dirt from the floor of the temple, where some words, a verse from the Torah, is written on a parchment and then dissolved in that water. And if she's innocent, she'll be fine. But if she committed adultery and she drinks that water, then she'll die a terrible death. If she's innocent, drinking this water mixed with some dirt and ink in it, there's nothing poisonous in the water. It's not like those reverse witch trials that they had in Salem, where, a woman is very unlikely to survive, and then that proves she's a witch. Here with the sota, she's likely to survive, unless she really is guilty, in which there will be a miraculous execution of her by the hand of God. But if she is innocent, she'll actually be more fertile, and the husband and wife will be permitted to each other, and he can rest assured there was no problem, and then she is likely to conceive. That's the case of the sota. So if a man had 2 wives, right? So there's co-wives. One of them was suspected of committing adultery with some other man. So she's the sota. And then what does that do to these laws of yibum? Right? That's what we're talking about here. Where am I? Yeah, so Rav and Rav Asi. So Rav added the co-wife of a sota, the woman suspected by her husband of adultery, while Rav Asi added the co-wife of an Elonis, right? This woman who just never had the possibility of having children physically. And the Gemara asks, and according to the opinion of Rav, and according to the opinion of Rav Asi, the enumeration of the Mishnah comes to exclude what? The Gemara responds, if each maintains in accordance with the opinion of the other, that they agree that these 2 cases could have been added but were excluded, then what else could have been, if they agree with each other, they just each one added that particular case, but they agree that both cases could have been added, then what else is excluded? And the Gemara maintains, if each maintains in accordance with the opinion of the other, then one enumeration of the Mishnah comes to exclude the co-wife of a wife who performed refusal. If the deceased brother had 2 wives, one of whom was a minor, and she refused the yavam, right? She said, no, I don't want to do this, and she's a minor and she's entitled to do that. So her co-wife is prohibited from yibum with him. However, the latter is not entirely exempt, and she must perform chalitzah. And the other one comes to exclude the co-wife of the wife who remarries his divorcee, i.e. a woman who was illicitly remarried by her former husband after she had been married to another man. It's a Torah law. If a husband and wife divorce, they can remarry, unless after they were divorced, the woman goes and marries another man. Then even if that second marriage divorces, she can't come back to her first husband. That's prohibited. If they did it anyway, then they're going to exempt each other from yibum and chalitzah, because that was not a legitimate marriage. And Rav and Rav Asi do not, and if Rav and Rav Asi do not each maintain in accordance with the opinion of the other, if they don't agree about the cases that they added, okay, then one enumeration comes to exclude the opinion of the other, as they do not agree that the law stated by the other should be included in the Mishnah. And the other one comes to exclude the first, and the other one comes to exclude one of the above suggestions, either the co-wife of a minor wife who performed refusal, or the co-wife of one who remarries his divorcee. And the Gemara asks, if so, according to the opinion of Rav, and according to the opinion of Rav Asi, let the rabbi of our Mishnah teach these cases. Since in their opinions there are more than 15 women to whom the principle of the Mishnah applies, why weren't they all stated by the rabbi of our Mishnah? And the Gemara answers, they were not taught because they do not completely fit all of the legal rulings that are included in our Mishnah. And the Gemara explains, this is because they do not involve the case of a co-wife of a co-wife. With regard to the 15 women listed, the discussion of the Mishnah concerning co-wives and co-wives of co-wives is appropriate. However, the two cases cited by Rav and Rav Asi do not leave room for such deliberations, as both a sota and then a lonis, the one suspected of adultery and the one who is sterile, are exempt and forbidden equally to all of the brothers because their prohibition does not result from a familial relationship that would lead to incest with one of the living brothers, but rather from a personal issue relating to the women themselves. Since none of the brothers may marry her co-wife, there is no possibility of a co-wife of a co-wife after the second brother steps in, and then now there's a co-wife of a co-wife, and then if the second brother dies, it goes to the third brother, and now the co-wives of co-wives come along in the restrictions. New subject. After analyzing the order and language of the Mishnah, now the Gemara starts discussing the laws themselves. From where are these matters? That if one's forbidden relative comes before him for yibum, he is prohibited to marry her and her co-wife. From where is this derived? How do we know this from the Torah? It is, as the sages taught with regard to the verse, Leviticus 18:18, and you shall not take a woman to her sister to be a rival to her, to uncover her nakedness with her in her lifetime. You cannot marry two sisters. Even if the first sister dies, you can't marry the second sister. What is the meaning when the verse states the apparently superfluous phrase, with her? And the Baraisa explains, since it is stated with regard to the wife of a deceased brother, her brother-in-law will have intercourse with her. Deuteronomy 25:5. From this I would derive that when the verse speaks of the commandment of yibum, it includes even any one of those with whom relations are prohibited, as mentioned in the Torah. Therefore, one derives a verbal analogy. It is stated here with regard to a wife's sister, with her, and it is stated there with regard to yibum, with her. So from the fact that the phrase with her is used in both places, they're drawing a connection between those commandments. And the Baraisa explains the verbal analogy. Just as their yibum involves the performance of a mitzvah, so too here the statement, uncover the nakedness with her, includes the performance of a mitzvah, a negative mitzvah. And the Merciful One states in the Torah, you shall not take. The phrase, with her, teaches that even in a case where there is an obligation of yibum, the Torah prohibition that prescribes forbidden relatives remains in force, right? So even though normally you cannot marry the woman who was married to your brother, but because he died childless, she becomes permitted. Special case. But any other prohibition does not get overridden by yibum. And that's why if that sister has some other familial relationship with the surviving brother, it doesn't get overridden. She's prohibited to him. Yibum doesn't apply. And because yibum doesn't apply, chalitzah doesn't apply either, not only for her, but for her co-wives as well. And the Baraisa continues, and I have derived only that she, his wife's sister, is exempt from yibum. from where do I derive that her co-wife is also exempt? How do we know that this is the case, that if a woman is exempt from yibum, her co-wife is exempt also? The verse states, to be a rival to her. That's why they're using the word rival wife, right? So Leviticus 18:18, you shall not take a woman and her sister, because then they become rivals, right? It wasn't, if a man in the ancient times had two wives, it wasn't that they were necessarily rivals of each other, but it could become that way, and you don't want to put two sisters in that situation, and that's why the Torah prohibits it. Okay, I'm calling them co-wives. The Koran Talmud here translates as rival wives, but okay. And the verse states, Leviticus 18:18, to be a rival to her, which indicates that not only is she prohibited, but so too is her rival wife. And I have derived only her rival wife. From where is it derived that the rival wife of her rival wife, right, the co-wife of her co-wife, if a man had two wives and he died and his surviving brother married both of them, and he already had a wife, the surviving brother, so now he has three wives. So from the one who died, there was the wife, the co-wife, and now the co-wife of the co-wife, right? And I've derived only for her rival wife. From where is it derived that the rival wife of a rival wife is also exempt? And the verse states, to be a rival, litzror, using the full spelling with a double resh and not latzor. This indicates that there are several rival wives, one after another. And I've derived from this verbal analogy only that the mitzvah of yibum does not apply to a wife's sister. From where is it derived that the same applies to the other women with whom relations are forbidden? You can say, so just as it's prohibited to marry a woman and her sister, so that's a prohibited relationship. So any prohibited relationship, exempts people from yibum or chalitzah if they're in play. And how do we know that all other relationships are in play in the same way? So just as the case of a wife's sister is specific in that she is a forbidden relative, and this is a prohibition for whose intentional violation, i.e. for intentional sexual relations with her, one is liable to receive karas, death at the hands of the heavenly court, and for whose unwitting violation, one is liable to bring a sin offering. And she is, right, that could happen if these people sleep together not knowing that they're prohibited to each other because, maybe it just wasn't revealed to them. There was an adoption, there was something in the past that was hidden. They didn't know that they were prohibited to each other. Then they found out, okay, that's not, the penalty for that is not karas. The penalty for that is unwitting violation. You bring a sin offering when the temple is standing. So just as for a wife, having sex with a wife and her sister, if you did it unknowingly, unintentionally, punishment is karas. Unknowingly, bring a sin offering. And then she is prohibited to the yavam and yibum. So too, with regard to all women with whom relations are forbidden by a prohibition, for whose intentional violation one is liable to karas, and for whose unwitting violation one brings a sin offering. That's what joins all these prohibited relationships, that the outcome is the same if they exist in the situation of yibum. They are prohibited to the yavam, and therefore there's no yibum and no chalitzah. And the Baraisa continues, and I've derived only the cases of those women themselves with whom relations are forbidden. From where is it derived that their co-wives are also exempt from yibum? You can say as follows, just as a wife's sister is specific in that she is a forbidden relative, and this is a prohibition for whose intentional violation one is liable to karas, and for whose unwitting violation one is liable to bring a sin offering, and she is prohibited to the yavam and yibum, and her co-wife is likewise prohibited, so too any woman with whom relations are forbidden, and this is a prohibition for whose intentional violation one is liable to receive karas, and for whose unwitting violation one is liable to bring a sin offering, and this woman is one who is forbidden to the yavam. Her co-wife is likewise forbidden. And the Baraisa concludes, from here the sages stated that 15 women exempt their co-wives and the co-wives of their co-wives from chalitzah and from yibum forever. Now, one might have thought that I should include in this principle even the 6 women with whom relations are forbidden that are more severe than these. One's mother, his father's sister, and so on, as stated in a later Mishna, which we'll encounter on page 13b. since they too are forbidden by a prohibition entailing charis, this would mean that their co-wives should likewise be prohibited to enter into yibum with this yavam as prohibited rival wives. So why were these women in particular relationships in this family, why were they not mentioned in our Mishnah? Well, in response, you can say, and I'm almost done, so if you've got questions or comments, get them in. Just as a wife's sister is specific in that she is a forbidden relative, and that this prohibition for those is a prohibition for whose intentional violation one is liable for charis, unwitting violation, sin offering, and yet she is permitted to marry one of the brothers, but she is prohibited to the yavam, and her co-wife is likewise prohibited in yibum. So too, with regard to any woman with whom relations are forbidden, and there is a prohibition for whose intentional violation you receive charis, and for unwitting violation you bring a sin offering, and who is permitted to marry one of the brothers, but she is prohibited to the yavam, her co-wife is also prohibited in yibum. And this excludes the 6 women with whom relations are forbidden by a more severe prohibition than those, since they may not marry the brothers, i.e. they are forbidden to all of the brothers. One's mother may never marry his brother, either because she is also that brother's mother or because she is his father's wife. Consequently, their rival wives are permitted, as the law with regard to a co-wife applies only due to the brother. In other words, the prohibition against marriage to the co-wife of a forbidden relative is applicable only in the instances of yibum. When the yibum bond does not take effect at all, the co-wife is not forbidden. We'd have to come up with that situation, but where, she's prohibited to all the brothers, but her co-wife is not. So then since she's totally prohibited, there is no yibum situation, then the co-wife would be permitted. But if there is a yibum situation and this woman is prohibited, then her co-wives are prohibited too. And the Baraisa adds, we have learned the warning concerning this prohibition that the yavam may not marry his forbidden relative from the verse, and you shall not take a woman to her sister to be a rival to her, to uncover her nakedness with her in her lifetime. From where is the punishment that he incurs if he transgresses and marries her derived? The verse states, for whoever shall do any of these abominations, the souls that do them shall be cut off from among their people. That's charis at Leviticus 18:29. That's what I've got for us today. Not easy stuff. You're still here. Well done. Nina was not able to stay and feed me questions, so I'm just going to scan the comments for questions now. Aoife, do couples struggling with infertility ever pretend to suspect the wife of being a sota? Well, first of all, we haven't had that since the temple. Without the temple, there's no sota ceremony. So that's never happened since the temple was destroyed. 2,000 years ago, would a couple struggling with fertility issues pretend that they're having a suspicion so that they would go through that ceremony and be granted miraculous fertility? I'm going to guess no. And the reason is that fertility would be a miraculous gift from God. Who knows what the real situation is? You can lie to people. You can't lie to God. So if God knows you made up the suspicion, he's not going to grant that miraculous fertility from that ceremony. But it's a good question, Aoife. All right. There's some discussion going on here. Let me just reload the Facebook feed so that I can see it. You guys are having a conversation amongst yourselves, so I would be playing catch up. Let me see. Sharon, I know I asked this before, but I remain befuddled by this. Boaz is the redeemer for Ruth, but subsequent genealogy lists the offspring as the child of Boaz, not as the child of Ruth's son. Chilon, I think. Boaz is specifically identified as the redeemer, and the other closer family member specifically doesn't marry Ruth because he doesn't want to father another man's child. Sorry to be so convoluted. Right, what's interesting about that situation is that it's not yibum, right? The man steps in as the redeemer, but he's not the brother of the son of Naomi and the husband of Ruth that died. He's like the closest family member of Naomi, who's going to step in and, do a kindness to Ruth so that she should not, be alone and with no status and, a stranger in a strange land and really in a tough spot. But he's not performing yibum. So, the other guy didn't want to have a child, and another man's child, which is the language of yibum. But Boaz isn't performing yibum. And at this point, the Torah has been given. So really, it's not yibum. The situation with Judah and Tamar, right? So the sons of Judah, the first son died. Then the second son does actually step in and perform yibum. But what's interesting there is that was before the Torah was given. So it was like they understood this dynamic even before the Torah, actually spelled it out. The chalitzah ceremony did not exist at that time. Then when then the second son dies, Onan dies, Judah ends up stepping in and fathers the twins, right, of Tamar, one of whom is an ancestor of King David. But Judah is the father of the two brothers that died. Again, that's not a yibum situation. He steps in as the redeemer, and we just see, how the incredible value that these stories place on making sure that the disenfranchised, the people who would be powerless in society, who don't have, somebody, children to take care of them, etc., how important it is to make sure that they're taken care of. But they don't technically fit into the yibum definition. What are you guys talking about? I think people are asking about the gate of the city, and is this the equivalent of a Beis Din? Very interesting question, right? That very often, like the Torah will say, you shall come before the elders at the gates of the city. And what they mean is that you're coming before a rabbinic court. So it's like, why would you do this? Like, you can imagine a city that has city walls. If you've ever been to, Jerusalem, you go to the old city, you walk through that Jaffa gate, right? It's like, okay, that's the gate of the city. Why would they do, some kind of a trial there? Wouldn't they have like some kind of a nice courtroom? And I haven't really researched the question that I could give a good answer. But it seems to me that what they were, what the Torah means, and maybe the way the sages determine it, and we'll find this probably later when we get to Tractate Sanhedrin, what they mean by the gates of the city is that it's done publicly, right? That it's not a closed door session, and that the results of this case will be known. And in these cases of yibum, why does that really matter? Because a child of a prohibited union, that's a mamzer, right? That's a terrible, terrible stigma for a Jewish child to carry, because he won't be able to marry, other people in the community. Maybe another mamzer, there's all kinds of, it's very, very difficult, right? And the child, through no fault of their own, became a mamzer because, his parents engaged in incest or some other kind of prohibited union or adultery. But that needs to be known, right? Because a mamzer can't hide that identity, lest they then, marry someone who doesn't realize they're marrying a mamzer, and then that is going to produce another mamzer. So these kinds of things need to be known. On the other hand, as we've seen many times, the sages are extremely protective against public humiliation. So if a case can be handled discreetly, it will be handled discreetly. But there are some things that just need to be adjudicated publicly so that the community is aware of what's going on. And perhaps that's just going on when it says it shall happen at the gates of the city. Okay, so I think that's enough for now. It's great to be learning with you, especially this tough subject, but hopefully we're going at the right speed and making things as clear, keeping them clear enough so that we can keep learning. But one thing that I remember from my first journey through the Talmud is it's okay to be confused sometimes, right? Like some stuff is just really difficult to grasp. And without lots of extra research and, like a better teacher than me, sometimes it's just going to be confusing. And that's okay because the Talmud is structured that sometimes the sages will go to the more confusing, complex case before the simple case. And it's like, why do they do that? That's just the way they do it. Right? So sometimes you just accept that you're confused, that it's a little overcomplicated, and that as we keep grappling with the same questions, it will become clear. They really believe in just throwing you in the deep end, letting you struggle for a while, and then you kind of make your way to the much shallower end, and by then you're much more comfortable in the water because you started with the very difficult case. So don't worry that sometimes it's confusing. It's okay. It's in fact to be expected. That's what I've got for us tonight. Today's Thursday, so tomorrow's class is noon Pacific. The Friday class always at noon Pacific. Have a great night and an early good Shabbos to you.